Imagine living in a world where your freedom could be taken away at any moment, where you constantly look over your shoulder for fear of being caught and returned to a life of slavery. This was a reality for countless enslaved people in the United States during the 18th and 19th centuries, thanks to the Fugitive Slave Acts. Did you know that laws existed as early as 1643 in America to deal with enslaved people who ran away? But things really started to get serious when the Constitution was written in 1787. By then, some northern states had already abolished slavery, and southern politicians were worried that these states would become safe places for escaped slaves. So they added a clause to the Constitution called the Fugitive Slave Clause, which said that enslaved people who escaped to free states would not be set free. These federal laws authorized the capture and return of runaways to their owners, with severe penalties for anyone who helped them escape. As resistance to the 1793 law grew, Congress passed the even harsher Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, sparking widespread outrage and controversy. At the time, the issue of slavery had become a major political issue in the United States. The country was deeply divided, with some states advocating for the abolition of slavery, while others staunchly defended it. As a compromise, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, but it only brought more pain and misery for the enslaved. Under the law, any person who assisted a runaway slave could be fined or imprisoned, including those who simply provided food or shelter to a runaway slave. It is heart-wrenching to think of the atrocities that occurred during this period. Enslaved people were treated as mere property, with their owners having complete control and ownership over their lives. They were forced to work in harsh conditions for long hours while enduring physical and emotional abuse. Families were torn apart, with children being separated from their parents, sold to different owners, and sent to different parts of the country. Despite the hardships, many slaves tried to escape from their owners, seeking freedom in the North or Canada, where slavery had been abolished, and they could live as first-class citizens. However, their escape was not without danger, as they were relentlessly hunted by slave catchers hired by their owners. These catchers would track down the runaways and bring them back to their owners, often using force and violence in the process. Federal marshals were authorized to arrest anyone suspected of being a runaway slave, and they were required to return the slave to their owner, even if the slave had been living in freedom for many years. This meant that anyone, anywhere, could be seized and sent back to a life of bondage, regardless of their circumstances. For free Black Americans, it was a constant threat of being falsely accused of being a runaway slave and being dragged right back into slavery. One of the famous cases of free Black people being illegally captured and sold into slavery was that of Solomon Northup, a free-born Black musician. He was born in 1808 in Minerva, New York, and grew up in a relatively privileged environment. He married Anne Hampton in 1829, and they had 3 children together. Solomon was a talented musician who often performed at local events and dances playing the fiddle. In 1841, 2 men approached him and offered him a job as a musician in a traveling circus. Eager to earn extra money, he accepted the offer and traveled with the men to Washington, D.C., where he was drugged, kidnapped, and sold into slavery. Solomon was sold to a slave trader named James H. Birch, who transported him to New Orleans and sold him to a plantation owner named William Ford. Solomon spent the next 12 years of his life in slavery, enduring brutal physical and emotional abuse at the hands of his various masters. However, despite the horrors of his situation, Solomon never gave up hope. He used his intelligence and resourcefulness to survive and never lost sight of his ultimate goal to regain his freedom and return to his family. Solomon made connections with other slaves and secretly taught them to read and write, even though it was illegal for slaves to be educated. Eventually, his luck changed when he was sold to a kinder master named Samuel Bass, a carpenter from Canada who opposed slavery. He helped Solomon to contact his family and secure his freedom. With the help of a lawyer, Solomon was able to prove his identity as a free man and return home to his family in New York. This story inspired the Hollywood historical drama 12 Years a Slave, which was released in 2013 starring Chiwetel Ejiofor as Solomon Northup. In the 1840s, many escaped slaves found a safe place in Cass County, Michigan, but Southern slave owners were angry and demanded a stronger law. They often blamed Northern abolitionists for encouraging slaves to escape, causing tension between the North and South. Many free states didn't want to follow the fugitive slave laws and passed their own laws to protect escaped slaves. And in 1842, the Supreme Court even ruled that states didn't have to help catch escaped slaves, which weakened the 1793 law. The Southern states weren't happy with the original Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. They thought people in the North weren't doing enough to help catch runaway slaves, especially with the Underground Railroad being so active. To strengthen this law, Democratic Senator James M. Mason of Virginia drafted the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which punished officials who did not arrest someone allegedly escaping from slavery. Officers were required to arrest anyone suspected of escaping slavery, even if the evidence was minimal. So, in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act became active to make things tougher on escapees and get more help from the federal government. The new law aimed to strengthen the old rules and get the South more support from the North. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 made the people in the North responsible for enforcing slavery, which caused many who were previously indifferent to the issue to take a stand against it. This law forced moderate abolitionists to either obey an unjust law or go against their beliefs. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin in response to this law. Many abolitionists chose to openly defy the law, such as Reverend Luther Lee, who helped slaves escape to Canada and was willing to face the consequences of his actions. This act created a system that allowed slave hunters to pursue and capture enslaved people who had escaped from their owners. These hunters were often given broad authority to enter free states, search for runaways, and take them into custody. This meant that enslaved people who had fled to the North in search of freedom were never truly safe, as they could be hunted down and returned to their former owners at any moment. The process of capture was brutal and dehumanizing, with slave hunters often using violence and intimidation to apprehend escapees. Many enslaved people were chased through forests and across rivers, forced to hide in swamps and barns, and constantly feared discovery. Some were caught and returned to their owners, only to face severe punishment for their attempted escape. For many, the threat of capture was a daily reality, making it nearly impossible to build a life of their own. People who helped an enslaved person escape by providing food or shelter were punished with imprisonment and a fine. Enslavers only needed to supply an affidavit to a federal marshal to capture a fugitive. This law made it easy for free black people to be kidnapped and forced into slavery, as they had no rights in court and could not defend themselves against accusations. The law made it harder for enslaved people to escape, particularly in states close to the North. The act increased the prices of enslaved people, particularly in the border states, by 15 to 30% more than in states further south. Abolitionists were alarmed. Even in supposedly safe states, people worried about their safety. Despite this law and many threats, many slaves still found a means to escape through the Underground Railroad network. The Underground Railroad was a crucial network of safe havens and sympathetic helpers in the northern states that actively defied the Fugitive Slave Acts. Escaped slaves from the South were secretly aided by Northerners who believed in the abolitionist cause, helping them reach places of safety in the northern states or Canada. The name Underground Railroad was chosen because it had to operate in secret using darkness or disguise, and railway terms were used in reference to the conduct of the system. The routes were called lines, stopping places were known as stations. Those who aided along the way were conductors, and their charges were referred to as packages or freight. The Underground Railroad had an extensive network of routes extending in all directions throughout 14 northern states and Canada, which was beyond the reach of fugitive slave hunters. It was the free black community, northern abolitionist, philanthropist, and church leaders such as Quaker Thomas Garrett who actively assisted slaves to escape via the railroad. Harriet Tubman, a former slave herself, was one of the most active conductors who helped hundreds of enslaved people to escape to freedom. Speaking of Harriet Tubman, we made a full documentary about her life on our second channel called The Culture Profiles. We'll leave a link in the description below if you want to check it out. Although estimates of the number of black people who reached freedom through the Underground Railroad vary greatly, from 40,000 to 100,000, it played a crucial role in arousing Northern sympathy for the plight of enslaved people in the antebellum period. The existence of the Underground Railroad convinced many Southerners that the North as a whole would never peacefully allow the institution of slavery to remain unchallenged. Many people in the North did not want their states to be used as hunting grounds for slave owners and their agents. Abolitionists organized groups to help enslaved people escape to the North. One of these men was Levi Coffin. Despite being born and raised in the South, Coffin, a devout Quaker, strongly opposed slavery. After moving to Newport, now Fountain City, Indiana, in 1826, he discovered that his home was on a route of the Underground Railroad, a network that helped fugitive slaves escape from the South to Canada. Coffin and his wife Catherine converted their home into a depot and used their wealth as prosperous merchants to hide and transport passengers on their journey to freedom. Despite reluctance from some neighbors to provide shelter for runaways, many contributed supplies to the more than 3,000 slaves who passed through the Coffin home. Catherine also organized a sewing circle that met in her home to make clothing for the fugitives. The Coffins were believed to have been the inspiration for the characters Simeon and Rachel Halliday in Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. Their second home, built in Newport in 1839, has been restored. As the cruelty from the South progressed, some states passed laws that protected accused runaways and freed black people. These laws gave accused runaways the right to a jury trial and prevented free black people from being kidnapped and sold into slavery. These laws were made by many northern states because they did not want to support slavery. There were a number of states that were ready to ensure that slaves still had their rights and freedom. In 1850, Vermont passed a law called the Habeas Corpus Law, which basically said that state officials had to help fugitive slaves who had been captured. This made it almost impossible for the federal government to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act in Vermont. This caused a lot of controversy across the country, with some saying it was like Vermont was ignoring federal law. Virginia's governor even warned that this could lead to the South seceding from the United States. Meanwhile, President Fillmore threatened to use the Army to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act in Vermont. Michigan also passed a similar law in 1855, and other states like Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin also passed laws to protect fugitive slaves. It was a really heated debate about slavery, and it reminded people of previous political crises in the U.S., like the nullification crisis in South Carolina in 1832. And Thomas Jefferson's Kentucky Resolutions in 1798. So after the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, many escaped slaves made their way to Canada instead of staying in the northern states. The black population in Canada grew from 40,000 to 60,000 in just 10 years, with many finding their way to freedom through the Underground Railroad. Black publishers like Henry Bibb and Mary Ann Shadd encouraged people to move to Canada, and by 1855, an estimated 3,500 of Canada's black population were fugitives from American slavery. In Pittsburgh, for example, groups of escaped slaves armed themselves and headed for Canada. Over 200 men left in just 1 month. In contrast, the black population in New York City dropped by almost 2,000 between 1850 and 1855. Although not everyone was against the law in the North, some northern businessmen actually supported it because of their commercial ties with the southern states. They formed the Union Safety Committee and raised thousands of dollars to promote the law. This group gained a lot of influence, especially in New York City, and helped shift public opinion in favor of the law. The passing of the Fugitive Slave Act ultimately contributed to the eruption of the American Civil War. Although the law was largely unenforceable in the North, tensions between the North and South over the issue of slavery escalated. This tension was fueled by several events, including the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, who was a strong advocate for abolition. The election of Lincoln was viewed as a threat to the institution of slavery in the South, leading several southern states to secede from the Union and form the Confederate States of America. The Civil War was fought over the fundamental disagreement between the North and South regarding slavery. While the war resulted in a significant loss of life, it also marked a pivotal moment in America's history. When the American Civil War first broke out, the Union didn't have a clear policy on what to do with enslaved people who fled their plantations and made their way to Union lines. Some Union forces returned fugitives to their enslavers, which angered many abolitionists. However, General Benjamin Butler and a few other Union generals refused to comply with this law, instead confiscating the enslaved people as contraband of war in setting them free. Butler argued that depriving the Confederacy of labor would weaken their efforts. President Lincoln allowed Butler to continue with his policy, but he disagreed with other Union commanders who issued broader directives to free all enslaved people in areas under their control. In 1861, the U.S. Congress passed the Confiscation Act, which aimed to prevent enslavers from re-enslaving captured fugitives. Sponsored by Lyman Trumbull, the law established military emancipation as the official Union policy, but only applied to enslaved people used by rebel enslavers to support the Confederate cause. Before this law, Union Army forces sometimes returned escaped slaves to their enslavers, but that changed in March 1862. When Congress passed legislation forbidding Union forces from returning anyone to slavery. Even though the Union policy of confiscation and military emancipation superseded the Fugitive Slave Act, the act was only officially repealed in June 1864, after James Mitchell Ashley proposed legislation to repeal the Fugitive Slave Act. But the bill didn't make it out of committee until 1863. The New York Tribune celebrated the repeal, saying, "The blood-red stain that has blotted the statute book of the Republic is wiped out forever." If you enjoyed this documentary, make sure you drop a like and subscribe to the channel. We aren't just telling stories, we're changing lives and waking the culture up. The video on the screen shares more Black history that they never taught us in school. Click on it now to watch. We'll see you over there.